Hi, my name is Sarah Elliott, and I am reviewing or doing an abstract for grandparents caring for their grandchildren, findings from the 2004 Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe, and that was found in the Journal of Family Issues in 2009. So my summary states that authors argue that although we see participation by grandparents in their grandchildren's care across Europe, the intensity of care varies by geographic location and employment status. So essentially what we're looking at is the role of grandparents in grandchildren's lives and their direct caregiving with regards to Europe and how that looks across the continent when it comes to precise location in the geography of Europe, as well as the employment status of parents, grandparents, and their role and intensity of their caregiving role. The main point, number one, being that in the 1990s we saw a lot more grandparents becoming caretakers for their grandchildren. So that means that they're providing direct care, whether that's sometimes or always, we'll get into in a little bit. But it's actually very similar to what we're seeing here in the United States. And that's what this study really aimed to look at as far as whether there was comparisons to be made or not. The second point is that we find that grandmothers are actually more involved in the care of their grandchildren when it involves full-time employment of the parents or if divorce is actually occurring or not. So in the case of divorce, then we see more likely the involvement of grandparents and especially the maternal grandparents in their grandchildren's care because they're having to step in and sort of take that extra role of direct caregiving. And the final main point is that we find in this study, according to the authors, that there are three distinct regional groups. So that's looking at different intensity of childcare by the grandparents. And essentially we're looking at a Scandinavian area where we see actually surprisingly more involvement of the grandparents than in Greece, Italy, or Spain. However, we're finding the intensity varies for regions. So while it may be more common in the Scandinavian countries for the grandparents to be involved, it may not mean that their intensity of their level of care is following along with that instance. So the results and conclusions that we're looking at is the percentage of grandparents who provide any care is much higher in the Scandinavian countries, as I said, than in countries like Spain or Italy, which is a little bit surprising because when you look at the intensity of care, it actually completely changes. So when you start to look at Spain, Italy, Greece, the intensity of care changes. So the authors what they use to differentiate between that is regular, which means weekly or more care, and then occasional, which means less than weekly care. And they did predict that the likelihood of grandparents providing any regular care, child care, is much less likely if the child's parents are employed. So essentially what that means is that if the child's parents are employed, you're looking at a higher involvement of grandparents' care, especially the regular child care. So that was a little unexpected because I think if you think about the religious implications of some of these countries, you think about the Catholic religion being prevalent in Spain and Italy, and you think about family involvement in those countries, you think maybe that the parents would be a little bit more, the grandparents would be a little more involved in the care of the grandchildren, especially that direct care. And it does prove that in the regular case, but as you're talking about occasional care and more frequent, it actually finds that Scandinavian countries are a little bit more involved in that regard. So that was a little bit surprising, I think, on behalf of the authors. Of course, the employment of the parent matters as well. The more employed the parent, the more involved the grandparent, and that is actually synonymous with the United States studies that have been done. If the employment of the parents is full-time, you see a little bit more involvement from the grandparents. And it also depends on the grandparents' employment, if they're still working or if they're not. In the case of divorce, obviously, we've talked about that a little bit. you're going to see more involvement from grandparents no matter what, but especially in the maternal grandparents. And I can speak personally to that in a little bit. But they definitely seem to have more of an influence and direct caregiving role than those grandparents who, grandchildren who are not a product of divorce. Did they give a persuasive argument? I think they did. It was hard to say because, so they maintained that their findings, which were taken from the 2004 Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe, which is shortened to be the SHARE study, they do align with recent studies done in the United States on the roles of grandparents in grandchildren's lives. So it is a persuasive argument in that they agree with studies that have already been done. So, the more studies that have been completed and found the same or similar results, obviously, that leads to a more persuasive argument. The authors go on in their argument to note the differences that they found compared with other studies. But really, it's more important that they found the similarities in other studies that were done because that leads to a stronger argument. As far as being persuasive or not, like I said, I think it really has to do with how many other studies have been done. So in line with that, it is persuasive. But they themselves, in their findings, I didn't find to be extremely persuasive. But if it's showing trends that have already been seen, then obviously, that provides its own amount of persuasiveness. So what did we learn from the article, and how does it relate to topics and themes from this week? I think essentially what we learned is the importance of demography and demographics, statistics and studies, as I say here. It's really important to have statistics and the demography studies, because without that, we don't know sort of how to quantify things. We don't know what studies to look at. We don't know what healthcare policies to examine, etc. So it's really important to have those statistics. It may not seem like this topic totally relates to this week at first, what we were talking about with demography, but it definitely does, because as we discuss life expectancy and longevity, and where we're discussing grandparents, obviously that's really important, because if we're talking about life expectancy and longevity in people, that means that we're looking at how long these grandparents are able to provide care for their grandchildren, especially. So if we're seeing a trend in grandparents providing direct care for grandchildren, and this continues to grow, then we need to examine what those implications could mean for the future and what the trends mean. But first we have to have the statistics, and we have to be able to quantify that to begin with. It also examines the ever-changing role of grandparents. This study didn't really touch on the history of a grandparent's role in the grandchildren's lives, but I think that's something definitely that we need to examine, because as we get older that may change. We look at generations having great grandparents, great grandparents that are still alive, and what that intergenerational community looks like. So, like I said, the longevity and life expectancy for elders and the implications, that touches on, what that means. Are we having grandparents that are living to be 93 years old, or are we having people that are dying at 67? And when you have those different life expectancies and those longevities, when you're looking at an older population and their role in their grandchildren's life, then that's obviously something that needs to be examined. It also implicates a changing role for parents. What does this look like if they're not providing the direct care? This means that the grandparents are, and so we're looking at a whole different set of morals and generational values that are being, instilled by grandparents to their grandchildren as opposed to parents. And also, it defines roles as a grandchild. What does it look like to be a grandchild? I think in the past we think of grandma and grandpa as being at least in the Western hemisphere, we look at it as being the spoiler person who comes in and wants to buy you all the presents and let you do whatever you want and eat all the ice cream. Whereas these people that are providing direct care for their grandchildren really can't do that. They have to step into that parental role. We also look at family dynamics. Obviously, pardon me. Family dynamics change when you have a parent who's out of the home, whether they're employed full-time or if it's a divorce situation, and what that looks like for families to be together. While also examining local, regional, universal relationships and roles within those societies. The Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere, I know that's said a lot and that's very broad terms, but the religious and the social implications of what that means is very different as far as the families go. The Western ideal of very individualistic society versus the Eastern idea of community really steps into play there, as well as having this duty to your elders in that Eastern society that is an ever-changing role, and I know we've spoken about in class as well. This definitely influences what we study and what we go forward looking at in the future as to why this might be a good thing to study. I don't know that this article necessarily brings about any public policy changes. I think that further research is necessary before we continue on this path. I could see one area that would require further information would be about the grandparents' parental rights in the case of divorce. For instance, in the United States, as we've discussed, currently grandparents are afforded no visitation rights, but in Europe this may not be the case. I'm not exactly sure. So further research would be needed to be done before any kind of public policy change would need to come about. You know, when I was looking at this, actually, I was not sure, as far as adding to my own knowledge of aging, I wasn't really sure that this would add anything because I thought, oh, sure, no big deal, parents raise children and grandparents raise children and no big deal. I didn't really think that it would speak to my own life at all, or that I would be able to bring any normal implications in this, but definitely, as you can see from this slide, these are my own grandparents, and my grandmother passed away a year and a half ago, and it's actually a very relevant topic for many different reasons, and these are mine, as you can see, and they helped raise me and my sister, who's there in the picture with me in the black t-shirt. And my grandparents were an integral part of my life. They helped raise me, and sure enough, I am also a product of divorce, and these are my maternal grandparents, and they had a very huge impact on my life, so much to the point where I dedicated my high school graduation speech to them. I lived with them for a time being with my mother, so they were a very heavy presence in my life, and it just goes to show that, more research definitely should be done on this topic, because grandparents have such a huge influential role on our lives, but it really also depends on our parents' requests of them and how much they want them to be involved. I mean, we have a very close family dynamic in my family, and so obviously it was no question that my grandparents would be a huge part of our lives, but I didn't realize actually until reading this article and doing this abstract just how much of a role they played in raising me and actually instilling their values, etc., on me. So I just wanted to end with that note because I think that it's really important to recognize that. So thank you very much. Again, my name is Sarah Elliott. Nice to meet you guys, and hope you enjoyed this presentation.